What if I told you that the world's largest religion, followed by over 2 billion people, is built on the ashes of a failed doomsday prediction? That the faith that promises eternal salvation was born from a catastrophic miscalculation about the end of the world? You see Christianity as a religion of love, hope, and redemption. Churches preach about heaven, grace, and life everlasting. But buried beneath 2,000 years of theological spin and doctrinal gymnastics lies an uncomfortable truth that religious leaders desperately hope you'll never discover. The very foundation of Christianity rests on what may be history's most spectacular prophetic failure. Tonight, we're going to examine the evidence that scholars have known for over a century but rarely discuss in polite company. We're going to trace the paper trail of broken promises, examine the desperate cover-ups, and reveal how a religion survived its own apocalyptic deadline. This isn't about attacking faith or mocking believers. This is about confronting historical reality with the same rigor we'd apply to any other ancient movement that made bold predictions about the future. The greatest threat to Christian doctrine doesn't come from atheists, skeptics, or rival religions. It comes from the unfulfilled words of Jesus himself, preserved in the very scriptures that believers hold sacred. And once you see this pattern, once you understand how thoroughly the early church scrambled to explain away their founders' miscalculation, everything changes. So, settle in, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the origins of the world's most influential religion. Let's begin with a simple question that haunts biblical scholarship. What did Jesus actually promise, and when did he promise it would happen? Most Christians today believe Jesus spoke vaguely about returning someday, in the distant future. They imagine his words as timeless wisdom, deliberately cryptic to maintain mystery across the ages. But that's not what the earliest records show. The Jesus of the Gospels wasn't speaking in metaphors about some far-off spiritual kingdom. He was making concrete, time-bound predictions about immediate, apocalyptic transformation. And the language he used leaves no room for theological wiggling. In Mark chapter 9, verse 1, Jesus makes a statement so clear, so unambiguous, that centuries of Christian apologists have broken their backs, trying to explain it away. He tells his disciples, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power." Read that again. Some standing here will not taste death. Not future generations, not distant descendants. The people physically present, listening to his voice, looking into his eyes, Jesus promised that some of his immediate audience would live to witness the kingdom of God arriving in power. This isn't poetic language. This isn't spiritual metaphor. This is a deadline, a specific, measurable prediction about timing, and it failed spectacularly. Matthew records an even more explicit version in chapter 16, verse 28. "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Again, the same promise, the same timeline. The same group of people who would supposedly witness this cosmic transformation. But here's the problem that keeps biblical scholars awake at night. Every single person who heard Jesus speak these words died without seeing any such kingdom. They lived ordinary lives, aged naturally, and passed away like every other human being in history. No cosmic transformation, no divine kingdom appearing in power, no Son of Man descending from the clouds. The first generation of Christians went to their graves waiting for a promise that never materialized. Now, you might be thinking, this is just one isolated passage, taken out of context by skeptics looking to score cheap points against religion. But the pattern runs much deeper. The entire New Testament is saturated with expectation of imminent apocalypse. Look at Paul's letters, written just 20 years after the crucifixion. This is a man who walked with the apostles, who claimed direct revelation from the risen Christ. And what does he tell his followers? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, He writes about the second coming using the pronoun we. We who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. Notice that language. We who are alive, not those who will be alive in some future generation. Paul explicitly included himself among those who would witness Christ's return. He expected to be standing there when the trumpet sounded and the dead rose from their graves. This wasn't unique to Paul. The entire apostolic generation shared this expectation. They sold their possessions, abandoned long-term planning, and lived in constant anticipation of the end. The book of Acts describes early Christians pooling their resources because they genuinely believed the current world order was about to collapse within months or years, but decades passed. Then a full generation. The apostles began dying of old age, still waiting. And a theological crisis began to emerge that threatened the entire movement. By the time the later New Testament books were written, the delay had become impossible to ignore. 2 Peter chapter 3 gives us a rare glimpse into this crisis. The author addresses what he calls scoffers who are asking uncomfortable questions. Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Think about what this passage reveals. By the time 2 Peter was written, enough time had elapsed for critics to point out that the fathers, the first generation of believers, had died without seeing the promised return. People were openly mocking the Christian movement for its failed predictions. And how does the author respond? With one of history's most famous theological patch jobs, with the Lord one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Suddenly, the concrete timeline Jesus had established gets dissolved into divine timelessness. The specific deadline becomes an open-ended maybe. This isn't profound theological insight. This is damage control. When your prophet's predictions fail to materialize, you have two choices: admit the failure and watch your movement collapse, or reinterpret the timeline to keep hope alive indefinitely. The early church chose option 2, and in doing so, they created something unprecedented in religious history. A doomsday cult that survived its own apocalypse by turning failed prophecy into perpetual expectation. But the evidence of early Christian apocalyptic failure runs even deeper than individual verses. The entire structure of the New Testament reflects a community grappling with prophetic disappointment. The later books show clear signs of theological evolution, gradually adjusting expectations as the original timeline proved untenable. Mark, the earliest gospel, presents Jesus as an urgent apocalyptic preacher, warning that the end is imminent. By the time John's gospel was written decades later, the emphasis has shifted towards spiritual transformation and eternal life, with much less focus on immediate cosmic upheaval. This progression isn't accidental. It's the literary fingerprint of a movement adapting its message as its core predictions fail to materialize. Each generation of Christian writers faced the same challenge: how to maintain faith in promises that seemed increasingly hollow as time marched on. The Gospel of Matthew provides another striking example. In chapter 24, Jesus delivers what scholars call the little apocalypse, describing the signs that will precede his return: wars, famines, earthquakes, persecution. And then, in verse 34, he gives another specific timeline. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This generation, not some future generation, living in distant times. The people alive when Jesus was speaking. And what happened to that generation? They experienced some wars and political upheaval, as most generations do. But they didn't witness cosmic signs, angelic armies, or the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. They died waiting, just like every generation of Christians since. Albert Schweitzer, one of history's most influential biblical scholars, recognized this pattern over a century ago. He argued that the historical Jesus was fundamentally an apocalyptic prophet who genuinely believed the world would end within his own lifetime. When that didn't happen, according to Schweitzer, Jesus died disillusioned on the cross, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This wasn't the conclusion of a skeptic trying to destroy faith. Schweitzer was himself a Christian, albeit one honest enough to follow the historical evidence wherever it led, and that evidence points to a stark reality. Christianity began as a failed apocalyptic movement that survived by constantly revising its timeline. The implications of this historical pattern extend far beyond ancient history. For 2 millennia, Christian leaders have used the promise of imminent apocalypse as a tool of control and manipulation. From the Roman Empire to modern televangelists, the message remains consistent. The end is near, judgment is coming, and only the faithful will be saved. But what if that urgency is built on a foundation of failed prophecy? What if the apocalyptic anxiety that drives so much Christian behavior stems from promises that should have been fulfilled before the apostles died of old age? The pattern repeats throughout Christian history with clockwork precision. William Miller predicted Christ's return for 1844, leading to what historians call the Great Disappointment. When the date passed uneventfully, Jehovah's Witnesses have revised their end times predictions multiple times as each deadline fails. Modern prophecy teachers continue setting dates that come and go without cosmic intervention. Each failed prediction follows the same script the early church pioneered. Reinterpret the timeline, adjust the calculations, and maintain that the end is still imminent. The failure becomes evidence of God's patience, not prophetic error. The delay becomes proof of mercy, not miscalculation. But underneath this theological shell game lies a more fundamental question about trust and credibility. If Jesus was wrong about the timing of his most important promise, what does that mean for everything else he claimed? This crisis didn't unfold in a vacuum. The early Christian communities weren't abstract theological debating societies. They were flesh and blood people who had reorganized their entire lives around Jesus' promise of imminent transformation. And when that promise began to ring hollow, the consequences rippled through every aspect of their existence. Consider what it meant to live as a first-century Christian. You weren't just adopting new beliefs or attending weekly services. You were betting everything on a cosmic revolution that was supposed to happen within your lifetime. The book of Acts describes believers selling their property and pooling resources because they genuinely expected the current world order to collapse within months or years. Why invest in long-term planning when eternity was knocking at the door? Paul's letters reveal the practical implications of this mindset. In 1 Corinthians, he advises believers not to get married because the time is short. Why start families when the end is imminent? In the same passage, he tells those who are already married to live as though they were not, because the present form of this world is passing away. This wasn't spiritual advice about detachment from worldly concerns. This was emergency planning for an apocalypse that Paul expected to witness personally. He was telling people to put their normal human lives on hold because cosmic intervention was just around the corner. But months turned into years, years turned into decades, and the people who had abandoned conventional life planning found themselves growing old in a world that stubbornly refused to end. The psychological impact must have been devastating. Imagine sacrificing your career, your family prospects, your financial security, all based on a promise that the speaker himself had stamped with a divine deadline. Now imagine watching that deadline pass while you're still washing dishes, paying rent, and dealing with the mundane realities of human existence. This is where the historical record becomes particularly revealing. By the time the later New Testament books were written, we can detect clear signs of community stress and doubt. The author of 2 Peter doesn't just address theological questions about divine timing. He's responding to what appears to be a full-blown crisis of confidence. The scoffers mentioned in 2 Peter weren't outside critics throwing stones at Christianity from a distance. The language suggests these were people within or close to the Christian community who had watched the original apostles die of old age without seeing the promised kingdom. These were individuals who had been there from the beginning, who had heard the original predictions, and who were now asking the obvious question, "Where is this coming you promised?" The response reveals just how desperate the situation had become. Instead of acknowledging the failed timeline, church leaders doubled down with increasingly elaborate explanations God operates on different timescales. The delay is actually mercy, giving more people time to repent. The signs are being fulfilled spiritually rather than literally. Every failed prediction became evidence of deeper divine wisdom rather than prophetic error. This pattern of reinterpretation created something unprecedented in religious history. A doomsday movement that could survive indefinitely by constantly adjusting its timeline. Traditional apocalyptic groups collapse when their predictions fail. Their leaders lose credibility, followers drift away, and the movement dissolves. But early Christianity discovered a different strategy. Rather than setting new specific dates that could be proven wrong, they shifted to a model of perpetual imminence. The end was always near, always urgent, always demanding immediate response, but never tied to verifiable timelines that could expose the pattern of failure. This theological innovation proved remarkably durable. For 2,000 years, Christian leaders have used the threat of imminent judgment to motivate behavior, justify sacrifice, and maintain authority. The message adapts to each generation while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The end is near, time is running out, and only faith can save you from cosmic catastrophe. The business model is brilliant in its simplicity. Create urgency without accountability. Demand immediate response to an eternal timeline. Promise rewards that can never be audited because they exist beyond death or in a future that perpetually recedes as you approach it. Modern televangelists understand this formula perfectly. Send money now because prophecy is being fulfilled. Support this ministry because the rapture could happen any moment. Buy this book because the end times are upon us. The urgency drives the transaction. But the timeline remains conveniently vague enough to survive any specific failure. But the roots of this system trace directly back to the theological crisis of the first century. When Jesus' concrete deadline passed without fulfillment, church leaders faced a choice: admit the failure and watch the movement collapse, or find a way to maintain apocalyptic urgency without apocalyptic accountability. They chose the latter, and in doing so, they created one of history's most successful systems for translating failed prophecy into perpetual control. The evidence for this transformation is written into the structure of the New Testament itself. Compare the urgent apocalyptic tone of Paul's early letters with the more measured institutional language of the pastoral epistles written decades later. The shift is unmistakable. Early Christian literature reads like emergency broadcasts from the edge of cosmic transformation. Later texts read like organizational manuals for a movement settling in for the long haul. This evolution wasn't accidental. It reflects communities learning to live with the reality that their foundational prophecy had failed to materialize on schedule. The theological challenge was enormous. How do you maintain faith in a promise that seems increasingly hollow as time passes? The solution involved a fundamental redefinition of what the promise meant. Jesus' words about this generation not passing away before witnessing the kingdom had to be stretched, reinterpreted, and spiritualized until they could accommodate indefinite delay. The concrete became abstract. The immediate became eternal. The verifiable became mystical. Each reinterpretation moved the goalposts further from historical accountability. If Jesus meant this generation, well, perhaps he meant the generation that would see the signs he described. If he said some standing there would not taste death, perhaps he was speaking spiritually about eternal life rather than physically about the parousia. The theological gymnastics required to maintain these interpretations would be impressive if they weren't so obviously motivated by necessity rather than honest exegesis. Scholars have documented layer upon layer of reinterpretation, each designed to preserve core beliefs while explaining away their most obvious contradictions. But underneath all the sophisticated theology lies a simpler historical reality. A charismatic teacher made specific predictions about divine intervention within a specific time frame. Those predictions failed to materialize. His followers, rather than abandoning their beliefs, developed increasingly elaborate explanations for why the failure was actually part of a deeper divine plan. This pattern repeats throughout Christian history with remarkable consistency. Every generation produces leaders who claim the end is finally at hand. They point to contemporary events as fulfillment of ancient prophecies. They set dates or suggest timelines. And when those dates pass uneventfully, they adjust their calculations and try again. The Millerite movement of the 19th century provides a perfect case study. William Miller calculated that Christ would return on October 22nd, 1844. Thousands of believers sold their possessions, quit their jobs, and gathered to witness the second coming. When the sun rose on October 23rd, with the world unchanged, the movement faced what historians call the Great Disappointment. But rather than dissolving, Millerism spawned multiple denominations that survive to this day. Each group developed its own explanation for why the prediction had failed, and its own revised timeline for when Christ would actually return. The Seventh-day Adventists claimed Christ had entered a heavenly sanctuary instead of returning to earth. Jehovah's Witnesses eventually settled on 1914 as the beginning of the end times, later adjusting this to an invisible second coming. The pattern is always the same. Failed prediction leads to reinterpretation, which preserves the core belief while explaining away the obvious failure. The timeline gets adjusted, the expectations get refined, but the essential message of imminent judgment remains intact. This system has proven remarkably resistant to disconfirmation because it's designed to absorb failure and transform it into evidence of deeper truth. Every missed deadline becomes proof of God's patience. Every failed prediction demonstrates divine mercy. Every postponement confirms that the end is even more certain, just delayed for mysterious reasons that mere humans cannot fathom. The psychological mechanisms that sustain this cycle have been studied extensively by scholars of cognitive dissonance and social psychology. When people invest heavily in beliefs that prove incorrect, they rarely abandon those beliefs. Instead, they typically double down, seeking explanations that preserve their core commitments, while accounting for contradictory evidence. Leon Festinger's classic study, When Prophecy Fails, documented this process in detail, showing how failed doomsday predictions often lead to increased missionary activity rather than decreased faith. The believers don't conclude their prophet was wrong. They conclude they need to work harder to convince others before the next deadline arrives. Christianity represents the most successful example of this phenomenon in human history. A failed apocalyptic prediction became the foundation for a religious system that has survived 2 millennia by constantly promising imminent transformation while never being held accountable for the delay. The implications extend far beyond ancient history or religious studies. This pattern of failed prophecy and perpetual reinterpretation shapes contemporary politics, economics, and social movements in ways most people never recognize. Any ideology that promises dramatic transformation just around the corner, while explaining away its repeated failures to materialize, is following the template Christianity pioneered in the 1st century. Understanding this historical pattern doesn't require attacking individual faith or mocking sincere believers. but it does require honest acknowledgement of what the evidence reveals about the origins and evolution of one of humanity's most influential religious movements. The uncomfortable truth is that Christianity's foundational promise failed spectacularly and publicly within living memory of those who heard it firsthand. Everything that came after represents an elaborate theological structure built on the ruins of that original prophetic failure, etic failure. The theological establishment has spent centuries perfecting this shell game, but the cracks in their foundation are impossible to hide once you know where to look, and the most damaging evidence comes from an unexpected source. The very people who walked with Jesus and claimed to receive direct revelation from the risen Christ Paul's letters, written just 2 decades after the crucifixion, read like emergency broadcasts from the edge of eternity. This wasn't a man planning for the long-term future of Christianity. This was someone convinced he was living in the final act of human history. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul delivers advice that only makes sense if you believe the world is about to end. He tells the Corinthians that unmarried people should stay single because the time is short. He advises those who are married to live as though they were not married because the present form of this world is passing away. Think about what this reveals. Paul isn't offering timeless wisdom about spiritual detachment. He's giving emergency instructions to people he believes will witness the end of everything within their own lifetimes. Why worry about marriage, career, or family planning when cosmic transformation is just around the corner? But here's where the historical record becomes particularly devastating. Paul uses language that leaves no room for misinterpretation. In Romans chapter 13, he writes, "The night is far gone, the day is at hand." In Philippians, he declares, "The Lord is at hand." These aren't vague expressions of hope, they're concrete statements about immediate timing. The Greek word Paul uses, engos, means near in time, not just near in possibility. When Paul says the Lord is at hand, he's using the same language you'd use to describe an approaching storm or an arriving guest. Something happening soon, not something that might happen someday, and Paul wasn't alone in this expectation. The entire apostolic generation shared this urgent timeline. James writes in his letter that the coming of the Lord is at hand, and the judge is standing at the door. Peter declares in his first letter that the end of all things is at hand. John, in his first epistle, announces that it is the last hour. Notice the pattern. Every major apostolic writer expresses the same conviction. They are living in the final moments of history. This isn't theological metaphor. This is apocalyptic expectation based on concrete promises they believed Jesus had made. But decades passed without cosmic intervention. The apostles began dying of natural causes, still waiting for a kingdom that never materialized. And by the time the later New Testament books were written, the crisis had become impossible to ignore. Second, Peter chapter 3 gives us a rare window into this theological emergency. The author addresses what he calls scoffers, who are asking uncomfortable questions about the delay. But read the text carefully. These aren't outside critics attacking Christianity from a distance. The language suggests these are people within or close to the Christian community who have watched the original promises fail to materialize. Where is the promise of his coming? They ask. For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. This is a devastating critique. The fathers refers to the first generation of believers, the people who actually heard Jesus speak. And the scoffers are pointing out an obvious fact, that entire generation died without witnessing the promised return. The very people Jesus told would not taste death before seeing the kingdom had tasted death without seeing anything except the same old world continuing its predictable course. The author's response reveals just how desperate the situation had become. Rather than acknowledging the failed timeline, he offers what may be history's most famous theological patch job. With the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. This isn't profound spiritual insight about divine timelessness. This is damage control. When your prophet's deadline passes without fulfillment, you have two choices. Admit the failure and watch your movement collapse, or reinterpret time itself to keep hope alive indefinitely. The early church chose option 2, and in doing so, they created a theological innovation that would prove remarkably durable. They transformed a failed doomsday prediction into a system of perpetual imminence. The end was always near, always urgent, always demanding immediate response, but never tied to specific timelines that could be proven wrong. This wasn't accidental. It was a survival mechanism developed by communities that had invested everything in promises that were proving hollow as time marched on. And the psychological mechanisms they developed to cope with prophetic disappointment would become the blueprint for maintaining apocalyptic urgency across 2 millennia. But the evidence of systematic reinterpretation runs even deeper than individual verses. The entire chronological structure of the New Testament reveals communities grappling with failed expectations and adjusting their message accordingly. Mark, the earliest gospel, presents Jesus as an urgent apocalyptic preacher, warning that the kingdom of God has drawn near. His message is immediate, pressing, unavoidable. The language pulsates with end times urgency. Matthew, written perhaps a decade later, begins showing signs of theological adjustment. The apocalyptic material remains, but it's surrounded by more teaching about practical Christian living, as if communities were beginning to realize they might need guidance for the long haul. Luke, composed even later, introduces elements that suggest the author is already wrestling with the delay. The parable of the nobleman who goes away to receive a kingdom and returns after a long time reads like a theological response to criticism about the non-appearance of Christ's kingdom. And by the time John's Gospel was written, decades after the original predictions, the entire emphasis has shifted. Instead of urgent warnings about imminent cosmic transformation, John focuses on spiritual rebirth, eternal life, and present relationship with the divine. The timeline has been stretched into timelessness. This progression isn't random. It's the literary fingerprint of a movement adapting its core message as its foundational predictions failed to materialize. Each generation of Christian writers faced the same challenge: how to maintain faith in promises that seemed increasingly hollow as the decades passed. The theological sophistication that developed to address this crisis was impressive, but it couldn't hide the fundamental problem. Jesus had made specific, time-bound predictions about divine intervention within his listeners' lifetimes. Those predictions had failed, and everything that came afterward was essentially an elaborate explanation for why the failure was actually part of a deeper plan. Consider the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew chapter 25. 5 wise virgins bring extra oil for their lamps while waiting for the bridegroom. 5 foolish virgins run out of oil because the bridegroom delays his arrival. When he finally comes, the foolish virgins miss the wedding feast because they've gone to buy more oil. Traditional interpretation focuses on the importance of being spiritually prepared for Christ's return. But read in the context of prophetic delay, the parable takes on a different significance. It's addressing a community that has been waiting longer than expected, whose initial enthusiasm is running out like oil in a lamp. The message becomes, yes, there's a delay, but don't give up hope. Keep your lamp burning. This is theology born from disappointment, not divine revelation. It's a community creating stories to explain why their foundational expectation hasn't been fulfilled, while encouraging members to maintain faith despite the obvious failure of the timeline. The pattern becomes even more obvious when you examine how different New Testament books handle the same material. The Synoptic Gospels preserve Jesus' statement that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. But they surround it with increasingly elaborate explanations and qualifications, as if later editors were uncomfortable with the straightforward reading, but couldn't remove the problematic text entirely. John's Gospel, the latest of the four, takes a different approach entirely. Instead of wrestling with failed timelines, John largely abandons apocalyptic language altogether. Jesus becomes the eternal Word made flesh, offering spiritual transformation that transcends temporal concerns. The kingdom becomes a present reality accessed through belief rather than a future event to be witnessed historically. This isn't theological development, it's theological retreat from claims that had proven embarrassingly false. The transformation becomes complete in the later epistles and Revelation. Instead of concrete timelines, we get symbolic imagery that can be reinterpreted endlessly. Instead of specific generations that will witness specific events, we get mystical numbers and coded language that can accommodate any historical period. Revelation, despite its reputation as a book of prophecy, is actually a masterpiece of prophetic ambiguity. Its symbols can be applied to any empire, any persecution, any historical crisis. The beast, the whore of Babylon, the number of the beast, all remain conveniently flexible enough to point to different enemies in different eras, while never committing to verifiable predictions that could prove the text wrong. This systematic vagueness wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate response to the crisis of failed prophecy that had plagued the movement from its earliest decades. By the time Revelation was written, Christian communities had learned that specific predictions led to specific disappointments. Better to speak in symbols that could be constantly reinterpreted than to risk another prophetic failure. The business model was ingenious. Create urgency without accountability. Demand immediate response to threats that remain perpetually imminent but never quite arrive. Promise rewards that can't be audited because they exist beyond death or in a future that constantly recedes as you approach it. Modern televangelists understand this formula perfectly, but they didn't invent it. They're following a template that traces directly back to the theological crisis of the first century, when Christian leaders realized they could maintain apocalyptic control indefinitely as long as they never again committed to specific timelines that could prove them wrong. The success of this system is evident in its durability. For 2,000 years, every generation of Christians has been told they're living in the last days. Every contemporary crisis becomes a sign of the end times. Every war, pandemic, or social upheaval gets interpreted through the lens of biblical prophecy. And when the crisis passes without cosmic intervention, the timeline simply gets adjusted and the process begins again. William Miller's prediction that Christ would return on October 22nd, 1844, created what historians call the Great Disappointment, when the date passed uneventfully. But rather than destroying the movement, the failure spawned multiple denominations that continue today. Each group developed its own explanation for the prophetic failure and its own revised timeline for the real second coming. Jehovah's Witnesses have repeatedly set and revised dates for Armageddon, each time explaining the previous failure as evidence of refined understanding rather than prophetic error. The dates change, but the urgency remains constant. The end is always near enough to motivate immediate action, but never so near that failure would discredit the leadership. This pattern repeats with mathematical precision because it's based on psychological mechanisms that transcend any particular religious tradition. When people invest heavily in beliefs that prove incorrect, cognitive dissonance theory predicts they will typically strengthen their commitment rather than abandon their beliefs. Failed prophecy often leads to increased missionary activity as believers work harder to convince others before the next deadline arrives. Christianity represents the most successful example of this phenomenon in human history. What began as a failed apocalyptic prediction became a religious system capable of surviving indefinitely by promising imminent transformation while never accepting accountability for the delay. But understanding this historical pattern reveals something profound about the nature of religious authority itself. The power doesn't come from being right about the future. It comes from maintaining the expectation that that the future will vindicate present sacrifices. As long as the reward remains just out of reach, the system can extract unlimited commitment from believers who keep hoping the next prediction will finally prove accurate. The tragedy isn't that Jesus was wrong about the timing of cosmic transformation. Human beings make incorrect predictions all the time, even charismatic religious leaders. The tragedy is that his failed prediction became the foundation for a system of perpetual control that has extracted resources, demanded sacrifices, and shaped behavior for 20 centuries based on promises that should have been fulfilled before the original apostles died of old age. Every time you hear a preacher declare that we're living in the last days, every time a religious leader uses end times urgency to motivate financial giving or political action, every time apocalyptic anxiety drives decision-making in contemporary Christianity, you're witnessing the direct descendants of that original theological crisis when the early church realized their founder's timeline had catastrophically failed. The system works because it taps into fundamental human psychology about mortality, meaning, and hope. But it works by perpetuating an expectation that was supposed to be fulfilled 2 millennia ago. And once you see that pattern clearly, once you understand how thoroughly the entire structure depends on explaining away its foundational failure, everything about contemporary Christianity looks different. The biggest lie in history isn't about supernatural claims or miraculous events. It's about time and trust. It's about a deadline that passed unmet, and a religious establishment that has spent 2,000 years pretending the delay was always part of the plan. This crisis wasn't just theological embarrassment. It was an existential threat to everything the early church claimed to represent. Because if Jesus could be catastrophically wrong about his most important promise, what did that say about his divine authority? What did it mean for his claims about salvation, eternal life, and the nature of God himself? The Apostle Paul, writing just 20 years after the crucifixion, reveals the psychological toll this uncertainty was taking on Christian communities. His letters read like damage control reports from the front lines of a movement hemorrhaging credibility. In 2 Thessalonians, he addresses believers who have become so convinced the end has already arrived that they've stopped working entirely. Others are questioning whether the dead will really be resurrected if Christ doesn't return soon. But Paul's response is telling. Instead of acknowledging the obvious timeline problems, he doubles down on the imminence. He assures the Thessalonians that he and they will be among those caught up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, in not future generations, not distant descendants, us, we, the people reading this letter right now. This wasn't spiritual metaphor. Paul genuinely believed he would be physically present when Christ returned. He organized his entire ministry around this expectation, traveling frantically across the Roman Empire because time was running out. Why plant churches for the long haul when the current world system was about to collapse? The historical record shows that Paul died under Roman execution, still waiting for a promise that never materialized. The man who claimed direct revelation from the risen Christ, who said he had been taken up to the third heaven and shown divine mysteries, couldn't accurately predict the timing of the one event that supposedly defined his entire worldview. And Paul wasn't an isolated case. Every major apostolic figure shared this failed expectation. James declares that the coming of the Lord is at hand. Peter announces that the end of all things is at hand. The author of Hebrews warns that Christ will appear in a very little while and will not delay. Say, these weren't casual expressions of hope. They were concrete statements about timing, written by people who claimed to speak with divine authority, and every single one proved spectacularly wrong. By the late 1st century, the crisis had become undeniable. Entire Christian communities had reorganized their lives around apocalyptic expectations that were proving hollow as the decades passed. People had sold their possessions, abandoned their careers, and put their normal human relationships on hold. Now they were growing old in a world that stubbornly refused to end. The Gospel of Matthew, written perhaps 50 years after the crucifixion, shows clear signs of theological panic. The author includes Jesus' promise that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, but surrounds it with increasingly desperate qualifications and explanations. Maybe Jesus meant the generation that would see the signs. Maybe he was speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem rather than the end of the world. Maybe the timeline was symbolic rather than literal. Each reinterpretation moved the goalposts further from historical accountability. The concrete became abstract, the immediate became eternal, the verifiable became mystical, and with each theological adjustment, the movement drifted further from its original apocalyptic foundation, while maintaining the urgency that made that foundation so compelling. But the most revealing evidence of this systematic cover-up comes from an unexpected source: the evolution of Christian art and symbolism in the centuries following the apostolic period. Early Christian imagery is dominated by apocalyptic themes. Fish symbols, anchor crosses, and references to Christ as the coming judge fill the catacombs and early church decorations. But as the timeline stretched beyond any reasonable interpretation of Jesus' words, the imagery shifted. Christ the apocalyptic judge gradually became Christ, the eternal king. The imminent kingdom became the timeless realm of heaven. The urgent call to prepare for cosmic transformation became the patient invitation to spiritual growth. This wasn't theological development, it was theological retreat from claims that had become embarrassingly obsolete. The business model that emerged from this crisis would prove remarkably durable. Instead of setting specific dates that could be proven wrong, church leaders learned to maintain apocalyptic urgency through perpetual imminence. The end was always near, always threatening, always demanding immediate response, but never tied to verifiable timelines that could expose the pattern of failure. This innovation solved multiple problems simultaneously. It preserved the motivational power of apocalyptic fear while eliminating the accountability that came with specific predictions. It maintained the authority of leaders who claimed special insight into divine timing while protecting them from the consequences of prophetic failure. And it created a renewable resource of anxiety that could be harvested generation after generation without ever being exhausted. Modern televangelists understand this formula intuitively, but they didn't invent it. They're following a template perfected by church leaders who realized that failed prophecy could be more valuable than fulfilled prophecy, as long as the failure could be transformed into evidence of deeper divine mystery. Consider how this system operates in contemporary Christianity. Every natural disaster becomes a sign of the end times. Every war or pandemic gets interpreted through biblical prophecy. Every social change or technological advancement triggers apocalyptic speculation. The message remains constant. Time is running out, judgment is imminent, and only faith can provide protection from cosmic catastrophe. But when the specific crisis passes without supernatural intervention, the timeline simply gets adjusted, and the process begins again. Hurricane Katrina was supposed to signal the beginning of the end. The Y2K computer crisis was interpreted as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered a fresh wave of end-times excitement. Each event generates the same cycle of apocalyptic interpretation followed by quiet readjustment when the world continues its predictable course. The pattern is mathematically precise because it's based on psychological mechanisms that transcend religious belief. Cognitive dissonance theory predicts that when people invest heavily in expectations that prove incorrect, they typically strengthen their commitment rather than abandon their beliefs. The failure becomes evidence that they need to believe harder, pray more fervently, and work more urgently to prepare for the next deadline. Christianity has survived for 2 millennia by institutionalizing this psychological phenomenon. What began as a specific prophetic failure became a general system for transforming disappointment into devotion, anxiety into authority, and failed predictions into perpetual control. The theological sophistication that developed to sustain this system is genuinely impressive. Centuries of brilliant minds have crafted elaborate explanations for why obvious failures should be interpreted as evidence of deeper truths. The hermeneutical gymnastics required to transform Jesus' concrete timeline into timeless spiritual principles would be admirable if they weren't so obviously motivated by necessity rather than honest interpretation. But underneath all the sophisticated theology lies a simpler historical reality. A charismatic teacher made specific predictions about divine intervention within a specific time frame. Those predictions failed to materialize. His followers, rather than acknowledging the failure, developed increasingly elaborate explanations for why the failure was actually part of a deeper divine plan. This pattern of reinterpretation created something unprecedented in religious history. A doomsday movement that could survive indefinitely by constantly adjusting its timeline while maintaining its core message of urgent transformation. Traditional apocalyptic groups collapse when their predictions fail. Their leaders lose credibility, followers drift away, and the movement dissolves. But Christianity discovered a different strategy. The key insight was recognizing that the power of apocalyptic belief doesn't come from accuracy about the future. It comes from maintaining expectation about the future. As long as the reward remains just out of reach, the system can extract unlimited commitment from believers who keep hoping the next prediction will finally prove accurate. This understanding transforms how we read the entire New Testament. Every book reflects communities grappling with the tension between failed expectations and maintained faith. The theological evolution from Mark's urgent apocalypticism to John's timeless spirituality isn't random development. It's a documented case study in how religious movements adapt their core messages when their foundational predictions prove wrong. The implications extend far beyond ancient history or biblical studies. This pattern of failed prophecy and perpetual reinterpretation shapes contemporary politics, economics, and social movements in ways most people never recognize. Any ideology that promises dramatic transformation just around the corner while explaining away its repeated failures to materialize is following the template Christianity pioneered in the first century. Environmental catastrophe, economic collapse, social revolution, technological singularity. The modern world is filled with secular versions of the same apocalyptic pattern. Crisis is always imminent, transformation is always near, current sacrifices will be vindicated by future events that somehow never quite arrive on schedule. When the predicted catastrophe fails to materialize, the timeline gets adjusted and the urgency continues. Understanding this historical pattern doesn't require attacking individual faith or dismissing sincere spiritual experience, but it does require honest acknowledgement of what the evidence reveals about the origins and evolution of apocalyptic authority. The uncomfortable truth is that Christianity's foundational promise failed spectacularly and publicly within living memory of those who heard it firsthand. Everything that came afterward represents an elaborate theological structure built on the ruins of that original prophetic failure. The system works because it taps into fundamental human anxieties about mortality, meaning, and hope. But it works by perpetuating expectations that were supposed to be fulfilled before the original apostles died of natural causes. The biggest lie in history isn't about miraculous events or supernatural claims. It's about time and trust. It's about a deadline that passed unmet and a religious establishment that has spent 2,000 years pretending the delay was always part of the plan. It's about transforming catastrophic prophetic failure into the foundation for perpetual prophetic authority. And once you see this pattern clearly, once you understand how thoroughly the entire system depends on explaining away its foundational contradiction, the question becomes unavoidable. If Jesus was wrong about the timing of his most important promise, what does that mean for everything else he claimed? The answer to that question threatens not just Christian theology, but the entire apparatus of apocalyptic control. that has shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia. Because if the foundation is built on failed prophecy, what does that say about everything constructed on top of it? This isn't just ancient history. This is the operating system that continues to drive religious behavior, political decisions, and social anxiety across the globe. Every time someone uses end times urgency to motivate immediate action, every time apocalyptic fear shapes contemporary policy, every time religious authority demands present sacrifice based on future promises, you're witnessing the direct descendants of that original crisis when the early church realized their timeline had catastrophically failed. The system has proven remarkably adaptable across different cultures, technologies, and historical periods, but its core mechanism remains unchanged. Create urgency without accountability. Demand immediate response to perpetually imminent threats, and transform each failed prediction into evidence of deeper wisdom rather than obvious error. Understanding this pattern reveals something profound about the nature of power itself. True authority doesn't come from being right about the future. It comes from maintaining the expectation that the future will vindicate present sacrifices. As long as the reward remains just beyond reach, the system can extract unlimited resources from believers who keep hoping the next deadline will finally prove accurate. Christianity didn't survive its prophetic failure despite the contradiction at its foundation. It survived because of that contradiction. The failed deadline became the source of perpetual urgency. The missed appointment became the justification for constant preparation. The broken promise became the foundation for unbreakable faith. And that transformation, from catastrophic failure to systematic success, represents one of history's most brilliant innovations in the technology of social control. The early church didn't just survive their founders' miscalculation, they turned it into a renewable resource that has powered religious authority for 20 centuries. But renewable doesn't mean eternal. Every system based on perpetual expectation eventually faces the question of credibility. How long can you promise that the end is near before people stop believing the promise? How many failed deadlines can a movement survive before followers start questioning the entire framework? The answer may depend on whether people continue to accept theological explanations for obvious historical failures, or whether they start demanding the same standards of accountability from religious predictions that they would apply to any other truth claims about the future. Because ultimately, this isn't a story about ancient religion or biblical interpretation. It's a story about how failed prophecy can become successful propaganda, how disappointed expectations can be transformed into perpetual hope, and how a single missed deadline can become the foundation for 2,000 years of apocalyptic anxiety. The biggest lie in history continues to shape the modern world because most people don't recognize it as a lie, they see it as faith, hope, and spiritual wisdom. But scratch beneath the theological surface, and you'll find the same pattern that has repeated for 2 millennia. Promises about the future used to control behavior in the present, with accountability always deferred to a timeline that perpetually recedes as you approach it. The pattern becomes even more insidious when you examine how this theological shell game operates in the 21st century. Walk into any American megachurch on Sunday morning, flip through Christian television programming, or browse the prophecy section of your local bookstore. The same formula that saved Christianity from collapse in the first century continues to generate billions of dollars in revenue today. Modern prophecy teachers have perfected the art of apocalyptic marketing. They point to current events as fulfillment of biblical prophecy, while maintaining enough ambiguity to survive their own predictions. The rapture is imminent, but the timing remains mysterious. The tribulation is beginning, but the exact timeline stays conveniently vague. Israel's establishment in 1948 was prophetically significant, but somehow we're still waiting for the generation that witnessed it to pass away. Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth sold over 35 million copies by predicting that the 1980s would likely see Christ's return. When the 1990s arrived without cosmic intervention, Lindsay simply recalculated and wrote new books with updated timelines. Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins built a publishing empire around the Left Behind series, depicting the rapture as imminent while never committing to specific dates that could prove them wrong. The business model is identical to what the early church pioneered: create urgency without accountability, promise insider knowledge about God's timeline while maintaining enough flexibility to survive prophetic failure. Extract resources from believers who fear being left behind when the cosmic deadline finally arrives. But the psychological toll of this perpetual emergency extends far beyond financial exploitation. Millions of Christians organize their entire lives around expectations that trace directly back to Jesus' failed prediction. They avoid long-term planning because the rapture could happen any moment. They support political candidates who promise to hasten prophetic fulfillment. They donate to ministries that claim special insight into divine timing. The anxiety this creates is measurable in contemporary survey data. Studies consistently show that evangelical Christians report higher levels of stress about world events, more fear about the future, and greater reluctance to invest in environmental protection or social progress, because they expect divine intervention to make human effort irrelevant. This isn't spiritual wisdom. This is the psychological residue of a failed doomsday prediction that refuses to die because too many people profit from keeping it alive. Consider how this pattern shapes American foreign policy. Christian Zionist organizations lobby for policies that they believe will accelerate prophetic fulfillment, even when those policies increase regional instability. They support Israel not primarily out of concern for Jewish welfare, but because they believe Jewish control of the Holy Land is a prerequisite for Christ's return. The irony is devastating. A religion founded on a Jewish teacher's failed prediction about divine intervention now influences global politics through believers who think they can manipulate world events to trigger the cosmic transformation that was supposed to happen 2,000 years ago. This theological feedback loop creates what scholars call prophecy addiction. Each failed prediction increases rather than decreases the appetite for new predictions. When Harold Camping predicted the rapture for May 21st, 2011, millions of believers organized their lives around his calculation. When the date passed uneventfully, Camping revised his timeline to October 21st. When that date also failed, he didn't lose his audience. He gained sympathy for being sincere, but mistaken about details. The pattern repeats because it taps into fundamental human psychology about control and meaning. People want to believe they possess special knowledge about the future. They want to feel they're part of a cosmic drama, larger than their ordinary lives. And they want assurance that current suffering will be vindicated by future triumph. Christianity provides all of these psychological benefits, while never having to deliver on its core promise. The end is always near enough to motivate immediate action, but never so near that failure would discredit the entire system. It's a perfect psychological trap disguised as spiritual hope. But the most damaging aspect of this pattern may be how it shapes believers' relationship with evidence itself. When you've been trained to interpret prophetic failure as evidence of deeper divine wisdom, you lose the ability to evaluate religious claims using normal standards of accountability. Every missed deadline becomes proof of God's patience. Every failed prediction demonstrates divine mercy. Every postponement confirms that the end is even more certain, just delayed for mysterious reasons that finite human minds cannot grasp. The system becomes immune to disconfirmation because it transforms every potential falsification into supporting evidence. This epistemological corruption extends beyond religious belief into areas like science education, political reasoning, and social policy. When people learn to treat failed predictions as confirmation of deeper truths, they become vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who understands how to exploit this cognitive vulnerability. Climate change deniers use the same strategy. when they point to incorrect predictions about specific environmental timetables, while ignoring the overall pattern of planetary warming. Political conspiracy theorists employ identical tactics when they claim that failed predictions about election fraud or government collapse actually prove the conspiracy is more sophisticated than originally imagined. The template Christianity created for surviving prophetic failure has become a general-purpose tool for maintaining false beliefs in the face of contradictory evidence, and this may represent the most toxic, long-term legacy of the early church's theological crisis. But perhaps the most profound tragedy is how this system has distorted the actual message that Jesus may have been trying to communicate. Strip away 2 millennia of apocalyptic anxiety and failed timeline predictions, and you might find teachings about compassion, justice, and human dignity that don't require cosmic intervention to be meaningful. The historical Jesus may have been wrong about the timing of divine intervention, but that doesn't necessarily invalidate everything he said about how humans should treat each other. The problem is that Christianity has become so invested in maintaining his prophetic authority that it can't acknowledge his prophetic failures without threatening the entire theological structure built on top of them. This creates a tragic irony. The religion that claims to follow Jesus' teachings has become incapable of honest engagement with Jesus' mistakes. Instead of learning from his errors about apocalyptic timing, Christianity has spent 2,000 years doubling down on those errors while developing increasingly sophisticated explanations for why obvious failures should be interpreted as mysterious successes. The result is a religious system that promises truth but delivers confusion, claims divine authority but demonstrates human fallibility, and demands faith in promises that were supposed to be fulfilled before the original believers died of old age. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. If Jesus was catastrophically wrong about the timing of his most important promise, what does that mean for his credibility on everything else? If the man who claimed divine authority couldn't accurately predict when God would intervene in human history, why should we trust his claims about eternal life, salvation, or the nature of divine judgment? These aren't questions that Christian theology can answer honestly without undermining its own foundation, because the entire structure of Christian authority depends on treating Jesus as infallible, even when his fallibility is documented in the very texts that believers consider sacred. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position would be impressive if it weren't so destructive to honest intellectual inquiry. Believers must simultaneously acknowledge that Jesus made specific predictions about timing, while denying that those predictions can be evaluated using normal standards of accuracy. They must accept that this generation will not pass away, referred to Jesus' contemporaries while explaining why that generation's complete extinction doesn't count as prophetic failure. They must believe that Paul's expectation to be alive at the parousia was divinely inspired, while explaining why Paul's death before the second coming doesn't discredit his apostolic authority. The theological gymnastics required to maintain these positions would be amusing if they weren't used to justify real-world decisions that affect millions of lives. When political leaders claim divine mandate for policies based on end times expectations, when parents refuse medical treatment for children because they expect rapture before the illness progresses, when environmental destruction gets justified because the world is supposedly ending anyway, the consequences of theological confusion become tragically concrete. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this entire system is how it has trained believers to mistake anxiety for faith, confusion for mystery, and disappointment for spiritual growth. The perpetual crisis of failed expectations has become so normalized within Christianity that many believers can't imagine what religion would look like without the constant threat of imminent judgment. This psychological dependence on apocalyptic anxiety may explain why attempts to reform Christian theology often fail. When you've organized your entire worldview around the expectation of divine intervention, removing that expectation feels like removing meaning itself. Better to maintain hope in promises that never quite materialize than to face the possibility that you're responsible for creating meaning in an indifferent universe. The tragedy is that this false choice between apocalyptic anxiety and existential despair prevents exploration of more honest alternatives. What if meaning doesn't require cosmic validation? What if ethics can be grounded in human welfare rather than divine command? What if mortality is a natural condition rather than a punishment requiring supernatural remedy? These questions threaten the entire apparatus of apocalyptic control because they suggest that humans might be capable of creating purpose and morality without depending on promises about divine intervention. And that possibility represents the real challenge to Christian authority. Not attacks from outside critics, but the simple recognition that life might be meaningful even if Jesus was wrong about when it would end. The biggest lie in history continues to shape contemporary consciousness because most people don't recognize it as a lie. They experience it as faith, hope, and spiritual wisdom. But once you see the pattern clearly, once you understand how systematically the entire structure depends on explaining away its foundational failure, the question becomes unavoidable. What would religion look like if it were built on honest acknowledgement of human limitations rather than impossible promises about divine intervention? That question threatens not just Christian theology, but the entire economy of fear that has sustained religious authority for 2 millennia. Because if people stopped waiting for cosmic rescue and started taking responsibility for human flourishing, the business model that transformed failed prophecy into perpetual profit would finally face the accountability it has avoided for 20 centuries. And that accountability might reveal the most uncomfortable truth of all: that the biggest lie in history wasn't about supernatural events or divine promises. It was about convincing people they needed salvation from problems they were capable of solving themselves if they could stop waiting for intervention that was never going to come. The pattern continues because it works, not because it's true. And it works because it taps into fundamental human vulnerabilities about mortality, meaning, and hope, while offering solutions that can never be verified or falsified. But understanding how the system operates is the first step toward imagining alternatives that don't require sacrificing intellectual honesty on the altar of theological necessity. Because ultimately, this isn't just a story about ancient religion or failed prophecy. It's a story about how human beings respond to disappointment, how authority adapts to preserve itself when its foundational claims prove false, and how the most powerful lies are often the ones that transform failure into virtue and confusion into faith. The early church faced a choice when Jesus' timeline failed to materialize. They could acknowledge the failure and risk losing their movement, or they could reinterpret the failure as part of a deeper plan and maintain their authority indefinitely. They chose the latter, and that choice created a template that continues to shape how power operates in the modern world. Every time someone uses future promises to justify present sacrifice, every time authority claims special insight into cosmic timing while avoiding accountability for specific predictions, every time disappointment gets reframed as evidence of deeper wisdom rather than obvious error, you're witnessing the descendants of that original theological innovation. The system has proven remarkably adaptable across different cultures, technologies, and historical periods. But its core mechanism remains unchanged. Create expectations that can never be fully verified or definitively falsified. Maintain urgency without accepting accountability, and transform each failure into evidence that success is even more certain than originally claimed. Christianity didn't just survive its prophetic failure. It weaponized that failure into a system of perpetual control that has extracted resources, shaped behavior, and influenced global politics for 2,000 years. The biggest lie in history isn't that Jesus made false predictions about the future. The biggest lie is that those false predictions somehow confirm rather than contradict his divine authority. And as long as that lie remains unexamined, as long as people continue to accept theological explanations for obvious historical failures, the pattern will continue. New predictions will emerge. New deadlines will be set. New explanations will be crafted when those deadlines pass unmet. Because the business of failed prophecy is too profitable to abandon, and the psychology of disappointed hope is too powerful to resist. The only question is whether future generations will finally develop the intellectual courage to demand better evidence for extraordinary claims, or whether they'll continue accepting promises about the future from authorities whose track record on timing spans 2 millennia of spectacular failure. The biggest lie in history continues because we let it continue, and it will keep extracting its toll in wasted resources, misdirected energy, and unnecessary anxiety until enough people recognize that divine promises about the future are subject to the same standards of accountability as any other claims about what's going to happen next. That recognition would represent more than just theological reform. It would represent a fundamental shift in how humans relate to authority, evidence, and the future itself. And that shift might finally break the cycle that began when a small group of disappointed believers decided that their teacher's failed prediction was actually evidence of his perfect wisdom. The choice, as it was 2,000 years ago, remains ours to make, ours to make. The historical evidence becomes even more damaging when you examine how this theological crisis infected every aspect of early Christian life. These weren't abstract philosophical debates happening in ivory towers. These were desperate communities watching their foundational beliefs crumble in real time as the people Jesus had personally addressed died one by one without witnessing the promised transformation. The psychological devastation must have been crushing. Imagine organizing your entire existence around a cosmic deadline, only to watch that deadline pass while you're still paying rent and wondering what to eat for dinner. The cognitive dissonance created by this failure didn't just challenge individual faith, it threatened the survival of the entire movement. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because instead of honestly confronting their prophetic failure, early Christian leaders made a calculated decision that would poison religious discourse for the next 2 millennia. They chose to transform catastrophic error into perpetual opportunity. The evidence of this systematic deception is preserved in the very texts that modern Christians consider sacred. 2 Peter, chapter 3, doesn't just acknowledge the crisis. It documents the church's response to critics who were pointing out the obvious failure of Jesus' timeline. Listen to how the author describes these critics. They're called scoffers, who ask uncomfortable questions about the delay. Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. But notice what this passage reveals. The fathers refers to the first generation of believers, the people who actually heard Jesus speak, and the critics aren't outside enemies attacking Christianity from a distance. These appear to be people within or close to the Christian community who have watched the original promises fail to materialize. They're asking the most devastating question possible. Where is this coming you promised? The people Jesus addressed directly have died. The generation he said would not taste death has tasted nothing but death. The world continues its predictable course without cosmic intervention. This isn't theological speculation. This is documented historical crisis. And the response reveals just how desperate church leaders had become. Instead of acknowledging the obvious failure, the author offers what may be history's most audacious piece of damage control. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Read that again carefully. This isn't profound spiritual wisdom about divine timelessness. This is emergency theology crafted to explain away catastrophic prophetic failure. When your teacher's concrete deadline passes without fulfillment, you have exactly 2 choices: admit the mistake and watch your movement collapse, or redefine time itself to keep hope alive indefinitely. The early church chose option 2, and in doing so, they created something unprecedented in religious history. They transformed a failed doomsday prediction into a system of perpetual imminence that could survive any timeline because it wasn't tied to any timeline. But the theological innovation that saved early Christianity from collapse would prove far more toxic than honest acknowledgement of failure ever could have been. Because once you establish the principle that failed predictions actually confirm deeper divine wisdom, you create a framework that's immune to disconfirmation. Every missed deadline becomes evidence of God's patience. Every failed prophecy demonstrates divine mercy. Every postponement proves that the end is even more certain than originally claimed. The system becomes self-reinforcing, transforming each potential falsification into supporting evidence. This epistemological corruption didn't stay confined to religious belief. It became a general-purpose tool for maintaining false expectations in the face of contradictory evidence. And that tool has been exploited by religious and secular authorities for 2,000 years. Consider how this pattern operates in contemporary American Christianity. Walk into any evangelical bookstore and you'll find shelves lined with prophecy books claiming special insight into God's timeline. Authors like Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, and John Hagee have built publishing empires by recycling the same formula the early church pioneered. They point to current events as fulfillment of biblical prophecy, while maintaining enough ambiguity to survive their own predictions. The rapture is imminent, but the exact timing remains mysterious. The tribulation is beginning, but the specific timeline stays conveniently flexible. Israel's establishment in 1948 was prophetically significant, but somehow we're still waiting for the generation that witnessed it to pass away. The business model is identical to what saved Christianity from first-century collapse. Create urgency without accountability. Promise insider knowledge about divine timing while maintaining enough wiggle room to survive prophetic failure. Extract resources from believers who fear being left behind when the cosmic deadline finally arrives. But the psychological toll of this perpetual emergency extends far beyond financial exploitation. Survey data consistently shows that evangelical Christians report higher levels of anxiety about world events, more fear about the future, and greater reluctance to invest in long-term planning, because they expect divine intervention to make human effort irrelevant. This isn't spiritual wisdom. This is the psychological residue of a failed doomsday prediction that refuses to die because too many people profit from keeping it alive. The anxiety that drives contemporary Christian behavior traces directly back to Jesus' miscalculation about cosmic timing. So here we stand, 2,000 years later, still living in the shadow of a deadline that expired before the ink dried on the first gospel manuscripts. The biggest lie in history isn't that Jesus walked on water or rose from the dead. Those claims at least can't be verified or disproven. The biggest lie is that his catastrophic miscalculation about timing somehow confirms rather than contradicts his divine authority. Every Sunday morning, millions of people gather in churches built on the ruins of a failed prophecy, singing hymns of hope while anxiety gnaws at their souls. They've been trained to mistake this anxiety for faith, to interpret obvious failure as mysterious wisdom, to accept promises from authorities whose track record on timing spans 2 millennia of spectacular error. The system works because it taps into our deepest fears about mortality and meaning, while offering solutions that can never be held accountable. It promises rescue that's always imminent, but never arrives, creates urgency without accepting responsibility, and transforms each failure into evidence that success is even more certain than before. But understanding this pattern changes everything. Because if Jesus was catastrophically wrong about the timing of his most important promise, if the man who claimed divine authority couldn't predict when God would intervene in human history, then maybe it's time to stop waiting for cosmic rescue and start taking responsibility for the only world we actually have. The choice that faced those first disappointed believers still faces us today. We can keep accepting theological explanations for obvious historical failures, or we can finally demand the same standards of evidence from religious authorities that we'd expect from anyone else making bold claims about the future. The biggest lie in history continues because we let it continue, and it will keep extracting its toll until enough people recognize that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, especially when they come from movements built on the ashes of their own failed predictions.